The Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was the period right after the Reconstruction era. These are the essential questions for the Gilded Age. Hopefully we will discuss these and cover these as we go through. How did the industrialization affect the United States in the 19th century? Explain how social Darwinism affected America's views on big business, and explain the rise and growth of labor organizations in the United States. And that's one of the most important ones here, as we have discussed and will discuss labor organizations throughout the year. All right, the Gilded Age. Okay, gilded means covered in gold or gold-plated. And we call this time the Gilded Age because on the outside, things looked really good in America. Things looked great from a different country looking in. We were becoming a world power. We were catching up, and even by 1900 will surpass Great Britain as the most industrial country in the world. But on the inside, things are a lot different. We didn't look like we were so golden on the inside, because that's where this is going to affect the people most. The people that are making our economy so great, the people that are making all the industry and working the long hours, they're the ones that are going to be suffering, as we're going to see. So from the outside, things look awesome, but from within, we're going to see a lot of suffering, except for the mega rich people. Okay, this is 1877 to 1910. Also, we'll call this the second industrial age because of some more technology that was produced during this time, and the use of power and or steam power and water power, etc. So let's get to the major concepts first. Okay, the major concepts of the Gilded Age is urbanization. At the turn of the century, more people lived in urban areas than in rural areas. And ask yourself why. It's because of our industry. And we became a nation of cities because people were moving to the cities to work. All right, so urbanization is going to be one of the major concepts. They were looking for jobs, so they left their farmland or left the farms that they were more likely working on and moved to the cities. Problems that included with this: pollution. I mean, we didn't have the EPA back then, so it was kind of fair game. Child labor. There were no labor laws, and people that lived on farms were used to having big families so they could have workers on the farms. Well, now this isn't going to change because they lived in the city. People will still have big families, but now they're going to be working in the factory. The idea of your childhood that we love so much and that we look back and playing with toys and all that stuff, that didn't occur. That didn't even become an idea until, after this period was over, because for the majority of kids, they're working. They weren't going to school, they were working. So that's obviously going to change, but it's hard for us to imagine that, but that's how things were. New York City, for instance, had laws against dog abuse before they had laws against child abuse. People moved to the city more and more, and so overcrowding is going to be an issue as well. And people who once owned some land now are going to be renting. So that idea of land ownership, especially in the city, is going to go away as well. Laissez-faire. Okay, laissez-faire is that government should not interfere in business. Okay, laissez means leave it alone, hands-off government. I used to remember this by saying laissez, lazy government. So we're going to see this as a major concept, and mainly because there just weren't any laws. But we're going to also see how this can become a problem as well. Another issue is the big businesses and monopolies. Okay, and part of that comes under that laissez-faire where there aren't any laws or anything like that. So the big businesses will basically just run rampant during this time. And that's going to become an issue because it's going to hurt the consumer. Now, if you're a business owner, that's your goal. But if you're a consumer, that's going to hurt that. Social Darwinism. The evolution of man, we've talked about this last year. So Darwinism is Darwin's theory of evolution. And we're not talking about that. We're not talking about the science aspect, but we're going to apply that theory to social situations in business and war and other aspects of life in that aspect. But here we're going to use it as business and society is a lesser business isn't going to survive. Survival of the fittest, and that becomes more and more prevalent, especially in business. But we're going to see it in imperialism as well. Some people are destined to be rich, some poor, some strong, some weak. And it's that survival of the fittest that basically says the weaker of the species will be weeded out. And species had to adapt. Okay, for instance, there used to be long-necked giraffes and short-necked giraffes. Well, what kind of giraffe are you picturing right now? There aren't any short-necked giraffes anymore. The long-necked ones won out. So that they're going to apply that theory, and this was not Darwin's intention, but they're going to apply that theory to business situations, to war, imperialism. And unfortunately, an unintended result is a lot of racism, especially in those imperial ages. So that's going to be an issue as well. The social Darwinism also will lead to what's called the Gospel of Wealth. And this is mainly a book written by Andrew Carnegie, who we will talk about in a second. Andrew Carnegie is one of the titans of industry during this time. And basically, he said, God blessed you with a lot of money, but it's a sin to die rich. Now, this is kind of funny because he also was trying to be the richest man in the world during this time. And he kind of changed his tune. There's a tragedy at one of his public areas where it was a private club and there was a dam involved, and they didn't do the necessary things to keep up the dam. He wasn't totally connected to this. He was just a member of the club, but it ended up killing, I think, over 200 people. So when this happened, he felt a little guilty, so he started giving back. And he did give back. I mean, he if you've ever been through Pittsburgh in that area, you'll see almost everything's named after Carnegie. Carnegie Hall in New York and other things. And Carnegie Mellon College is one of the best colleges in the world, and that's in Pittsburgh. It was donated, many libraries. But this is after his pursuit to be the richest man in America. Let's not forget that, too. Mass production and consumption. Larger factories, assembly lines led to mass production of goods. With so many of the same items available, it's going to actually help the consumer because it's going to drive that price down. So those things really help us, and it creates a cycle. You're working more, you're getting paid more, you can afford more. Also, as you're making more of these things, the prices drop down so people can actually buy these goods. The goods become more popular, more goods are needed. It creates a pretty good cycle there for mass production. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Hold on. So that's some of the other major aspects. And then unions, we're going to get into this more. I'm just going to give you a quick overview. But basically, unions are born out of this labor unrest. The fuel of the Second Industrial Revolution and the fuel of the Gilded Age is the worker. You can say steam power, you can say coal, you can say whatever, but it's the American worker that is the fuel. And frankly, they get tired of being used during this time. And so they're going to work countless hours, and I'm not sure what's happening there, and they're going to come together to basically form these early labor unions, and they figured out if they all get together, they have one single voice, that they're going to have more and more power. And definitely needed back then, especially in railroads, construction, steel industries. Most of these workers are barely surviving. They lived in poverty. They're working long, hard hours for cheap pay. So they're going to rise up and work for higher wages. So this is how the labor movement began. And many times, as we're going to see, it becomes pretty violent. So we'll discuss that. Political corruption and the machine politics, a major part of this Gilded Age. Lots of corruption during this time period. Okay, even some nicknames are given out, such as, and we've talked about, Useless Grant with the Credit Mobilier scandal, Rutherford B. Hayes. There's a bunch of grafts, kickbacks, bribes. The political bosses are taking advantage of the immigrants moving in and taking advantage of their votes. They ran it like mafia bosses almost. Okay, the immigrants are getting off the boats, and certain politicians would go after these whole sects of these immigrants, and they would promise them food, shelter, and jobs. And these immigrants would then vote for them, and it created this big power vacuum for this, especially in the big cities. Hundreds and thousands of immigrants are getting off the boat, every month, and in New York and San Francisco, and then they moved to Chicago. They would greet them and promise them these things for their votes, and these voting blocks were developed. Immigrants settled into Boston, New York, and Chicago. Look at those areas. You can still go to these places. Little Italy, Chinatown. Those areas still exist. Whole neighborhoods would be of basically immigrants of certain ethnic groups. It's changed over time, but you can still see that because those immigrants flocked to people that they were familiar with. And the good that comes out of this, and there is some good, but the good that came out of it helped the immigrants. They didn't have those opportunities without these political machines. However, the bad is it kind of kept them as second-class citizens, and also led to more corruption. So that led to that. Farming problems, prices, and overproduction. New technology led to improved productivity. The problem is they didn't realize that the more they produced, the cheaper their prices would be because they were overproducing. They were producing too much of these goods, and the supply began to exceed demand, and it became too much, so prices are going to drop. So that's going to hurt farmers, and that's still a struggle for farmers today. There's always a balance that they try to achieve. And then unequal distribution of wealth. Okay? Around this time, the top 1% of families in America controlled 60% of the wealth. Okay, so and you can still argue that's a problem today, depending on what side you're on. If you're in that top 1%, it's not a problem. But an example of this is if one family in 100 would get $60 out of $100. So let's say I had 60 kids in class. I had 100 kids in class, and I give one kid $60, and the rest of you would split what's left. That would be a pretty good depiction of what was going on. Okay, so those are the major concepts of this time, and along with some more inventions, which we will discuss here shortly. Like I said, we also called this time the Second Industrial Revolution. So you might hear me reference that, or you might hear that being referenced in other productions. Now, big business. Okay, back to the big business. Monopolies, they eliminate competition, and that was their whole goal, to eliminate that competition. Sometimes monopolies form simply because they did things better than everyone else, and some of you are thinking, well, what's wrong with that? And that becomes a big issue. Is that an issue? Should that be against the law? If your company does something better than anybody else, you actually get punished by being labeled a monopoly, and that's still an issue today. But it does eliminate competition, which and a lot of times hurts the consumer. Imagine having a service that one person can only do, or one company can only have the service. Let's say there's one company that makes toilet paper in the United States. Well, what can they charge? We need toilet paper. Okay, they can charge whatever they want, right? So that becomes an issue. The fact that there are many toilet paper producers helps us, and it keeps the price of toilet paper down, and that is something that we need, I hope. So that's an issue. Corporations, a way of organizing a business, structuring, and breaking them down into corporations to raise more money. Okay, this will actually lead to breaking companies down into different stocks where you can actually buy a piece of the company and just watch the news. You'll hear that on the news, especially you can look in the paper and look at the economy section. All those stocks, that's exactly what that is. Laissez-faire, relation with the government. What should the government be allowed to do? And this is still an issue today, and it always will be. How much can the government have to do with business? How much should the government be involved in business? And that becomes an issue. Should they be saddled with regulations, or should they be free to do what they want? And the answer, depending on what you guys believe, it's probably in the middle somewhere. But monopolies are great if you own them, but bad for the consumer. Regulations are good in some cases for smaller and other companies, but in a lot of cases it punishes companies that do things better than most. So it's still an issue today, and you can just turn on the news and see that. And that's a big discussion there today. Okay, and then of course rugged individualism goes back to social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. Let's let these companies duke it out. Let's let them just figure it out for themselves. That becomes an argument for the time period as well. The big business people, let's stop here. We will continue this in another lecture. Thank you.